Thank you everyone for getting settled, and thank you for coming along tonight. And I must have my notes already. And thank you to Trina and Ruby for joining us online. It's really wonderful to see so many people turn out for our first event of 2025. So thank you for joining us. I'd also like to welcome our fabulous speakers, Stav Satalis and Jayshree Mankabai, and I will give them a full introduction shortly. So, I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. While we always pay our respects to all Indigenous people in this country, I think around International Women's Day, it is particularly important to acknowledge the very gendered impacts of colonialism in Australia and around the world. The ongoing impacts of colonisation continue to impact the health, education, livelihoods and happiness of Indigenous women in this country. So as we continue to march forward in line with the International Women's Day theme, we need to make sure that we are creating a space where Indigenous women can march alongside us. So in saying that, I would like to pay my respect to all elders past, present and emerging of the Gadigal people and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. So, onto our general informational spiel. Women in Aid and Development is a membership organisation for all women who work in or aspire to work in the international development and humanitarian aid sectors, inclusive of trans women and non-binary people. We're part of a global community of professionals, and we'd love for you to join us in celebrating women across the sector, sharing our experiences and supporting and inspiring each other to pursue and succeed in leadership roles. You can connect with us and other fantastic women in the sector by engaging with our Facebook and LinkedIn pages. And if you're particularly inspired by anything our lovely speakers say tonight that you'd like to share on social media, please tag us because we'd love to know what your key takeaways are. We've also got some sheets over there on the side where you can suggest future topics and say any of your key takeaways for us to have a look at and look on for the future. So, my name's Jamie McLaughlin, my pronouns are she, her, and I'll be facilitating this evening's session for you. I'm currently working with the Australian Red Cross and I have a background of experience in higher education, government and non-profits. I'm also a member of the Women in Aid and Development Events Committee, which meets regularly to discuss ideas for these events, organise them and find speakers. So I'd like to acknowledge my fellow Women in Aid and Development. I can speak tonight, my goodness gracious me. Okay. It's the fancy of Mrs. Border that's throwing me off. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow Women in Aid and Development people present tonight, including our fabulous volunteers, our board members, and of course our wonderful chair, Chris Franks. So just some quick housekeeping before we begin. The bathrooms, in case anyone hasn't found them yet, are out past reception. So if you head directly out the door and then turn left at the end of the wood on the floor, you should find the bathrooms pretty easily. And the exits are just through the lifts. Please help yourself to food and drink throughout the whole evening and feel free to grab any leftovers to take with you at the end. We don't want them just going to waste. And we will be continuing, oh my goodness gracious, I'm thrown off tonight, with our networking after we finish with our speakers. So please feel free to hang around and continue to grab contact details from our lovely speakers or anyone else wonderful you'd like to stay with tonight. And our session is being recorded as the thing so proudly announced for us. So we will share that with you afterwards so you can listen back and also share with others who might be interested. So on to our topic for this evening. International Women's Day and its theme for 2025, the March Forward, celebrates 30 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action for Achieving Gender Equality. Since then, women have broken barriers, reshaped policies, and ignited powerful movements worldwide. However, millions of women and girls still face systemic inequalities, rising violence, and economic disparities that hold them back from reaching their full potential. Tonight, we'll have the pleasure of listening to our speakers about how we can support women to conquer these challenges in many different ways, from microfinance to education to decolonisation. We'll have more time for questions at the end. I'll be guiding the discussion throughout the night, but of course, most of these questions are going to come from you, and we've had a few submitted online from people who put those in while they were signing up, so thank you. We'll be asking those as well. But while you're listening, please make a mental note of anything that really interests you and ask our speakers at the end. So, with all of that out of the way, I would like to properly introduce our speakers for this evening. Our first speaker is the wonderful Stav Satalis. Stav is the Executive Director of Indigo Foundation, which has supported grassroots movements in some of the most marginalised communities in the world to pursue their development goals and to promote and defend their human rights. She has 28 years experience in the international development sector, having worked for AusAid, ActionAid and CARE throughout Asia. Stav also has 20 years voluntary work experience in Australia and overseas, including serving as a board member and advisor for local NGOs. She's passionate about gender equality, economic justice, and locally led development. And our fabulous second speaker for the night is Jayashree Mangubai. Jayashree is the Gender Equality, Disability and Social Inclusion Advisor at Child Fund Australia, which supports children and young people in the Asia-Pacific region to enjoy their rights, including education, health and safety. She is also an independent consultant supporting various Pacific programs in the areas of gender equality, disability equity and rights. Jayashree has worked and volunteered on human rights and development issues for local CSOs in India and with Christian Aid across South Asia before moving on to work in the Pacific. She's passionate about a range of social justice issues, including gender equality, racial justice, and decolonising development. So a huge welcome to our fabulous speakers. So to start us off, I might start with you, Stav. Could you give us a brief overview of what your career journey has been like in the aid and development sector, and particularly your work on gender and supporting women to march forward?
Thanks, Jamie Lee. So I became interested in sort of what was happening in the world when I was in my teenage years, and I did a bit of political science when I was at high school. But I come from a Greek migrant family, so I thought I better study commerce instead of political science. So I did that, and then I worked for 4.5 years in a variety of chartered accounting firms and also a merchant bank, but it was clear that that was not going to give me life satisfaction. So I went back to uni and studied a Master's of International Relations through the School of Political Science at UNSW. And then I started working in aid as a graduate at AusAid, which I think some of you in the room might know, used to exist as an autonomous agency and then was subsumed within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I think that was in 2013, about a decade ago, when Tony Abbott took over. So I was there for 8 years, working sort of in a variety of sort of technical but also management roles. It was interesting working under the sort of Howard years in the government agency. They do have a lot of money, and I was able to, do some interesting things. We didn't talk about locally led development back then. I mean, there's a lot more talk about it, not as much action, but we'll probably come to that in the Q&A. And then I moved overseas, and I did a short stint in Solomon Islands for 9 months, working for Ramsay, which was sensibly the Australian government with a bit of support from others. But it was clear that the development model they were pursuing was just so wrong on so many levels. So I then moved to Bangladesh, and I spent 4.5 years working there. I did some consulting work first. I'd already been to Bangladesh 5 times when I was working at AusAid, so I was quite familiar with the place. I did a consultancy for BRAC, which some of you might know is the largest NGO in the world. It was incredible. We were a team of 7 of us looking at their graduate program, which is essentially for those people that are too poor for microfinance. And I think the proposal was like $100 and something million. And then did some work for UNDP in Chittagong Hill Tracts. And then I started working at CARE as the assistant country director. I then moved to Cambodia as the country director for CARE. I was there for about 4 years. And then in 2015, I moved to Myanmar as the country director for CARE. I think within a year of being in Myanmar, I was ready to leave, but it was a very difficult place to work, even though there'd been an election and the NLD had, taken power. It was a very difficult place to work, partly because a third of CARE's work at the time was in the northern part of Rakhine. When I arrived, there was only a handful of agencies that had access. A lot of agencies worked in and around Setway in the camps, but CARE and a number of others worked up in the northern part of Rakhine, and it was such a restrictive and awful place for the Rohingya. And then in 2016, there were attacks, and then in 2017, there was the genocide that took place where 700,000 people joined about another 300,000 in Bangladesh, and they're still there. So I think after a few years of being also quite silent, I think that's what I found quite difficult about living in Myanmar. Most of my colleagues were from the dominant class, which is the Bamar people, beautiful colleagues. But there are also 35 around there, ethnic groups, not including the Rohingya. So it was a very divided place back then, and it was very difficult because when we'd go to visit the government in Rakhine or in Naypyidaw, it would be like, we don't talk about the Rohingya. And so, yeah, so it's very difficult being, and for me it was okay because I had an Australian passport, I could come back home, but for them, you know, it was dangerous. So my first responsibility as a country director was the safety and security of my team. That's what my boss told me at the time. So I moved back to Sydney after 22 years away, and was very fortunate to work with the incredible ActionAid. I was there for 2 years doing their global engagement work, and then I needed a break. It was about 2021 when the situation in Myanmar just imploded, and I felt like I needed a break. So I took 16 months off to work out what I wanted to do. It was a bit scary, but it was the best thing I did. And in that time, I was introduced to the Indigo Foundation, and it was sort of, you know, their approach is something that I really believe in, which is about giving resources and power and supporting local organisations and doing it in a light way, you know, not with lots of requirements and reports and so forth. And so I've been there for about just over 2 years. So your second question about working with women and contributing. Some of the places where I've worked, like particularly Myanmar, we did some fabulous work supported by a range of Scandinavian donors, some work from DFAD and others. We supported the sex workers in Myanmar, which was not about trying to change their vocation, but it was actually it was a rights-based approach. So it was about making sure that their kids could go to school, they could rent places to live, the police didn't harass them. So it was really, I think, that sort of systemic change work. And they were leading, it was a, you know, ferocious team of women that were leading that work. There was also work that was done by my local colleagues, you know, because Myanmar is quite a diverse place, but there was also work done with a number of women's sort of groups in Shan State and also in Kaya State. And yeah, I think that went, and we also did some urban programming as well. And I think for me, the theory of change that CARE had, which I think sort of resonates with me as well, is they present it as three sort of intersecting circles. Often organisations want to work with women, and women have the burden of making the change. So, you know, giving the women the skills and the experience and the confidence and all that, and then they've got to get on and do it. But the other two the other parts of that sort of approach is working on structures and policies and also attitudes. That's a big one, and it's attitudes also of women and men. Like at the time, there was an attempt to get more women elected, you know, in Myanmar, and women themselves could not see themselves as leaders. Before I arrived, there'd been some work that was done, and yeah, women themselves would say, yeah, I don't think that women can be leaders. So there's work done around the sort of systems, and then it's also with the power holders. You know, if you're going to make proper change, you really need to shift things with people that hold power, and that's different in every context. Like when I worked in Bangladesh, mother-in-laws had a lot of power, as well as the religious leaders and, you know, the local, you know, the Union Parishad sort of people that were in charge of local government. And it was trying to work with them to change attitudes. We had this incredible program where we were trying to reduce maternal mortality, so the number of women and children that were dying during childbirth. And what we found was that the mother-in-laws would think, I don't want my daughter to go to the health centre because she might have a male doctor, and I gave birth at home, so that should be good enough for her as well. And then sort of doing work around explaining that you shouldn't actually be dieting when you're pregnant because you are feeding a child as well. And so there was a lot of work that was done with, with power holders there. I remember I was in a large meeting in Dhaka, and there was a representative from one of the local councils, and he'd adopted, I think it was in Chittagong, and he'd adopted this whistle. So every night at 9 o'clock, he would blow the whistle so the women could take their tablet, which was their birth control. Because I think he had understood through work that was done by my colleagues, who were, you know, probably men in that case, talking about the importance of birth spacing, you know, how you're more likely for the child to, you know, to develop and so forth. I know a lot of that work that I just described in Myanmar has unravelled. A lot of the groups in some of the places are in hiding, on the run. So I don't know what any lasting impact might be from that work. It's really hard, I think. I think some of our frameworks that we have to measure what results might be, I think are a bit tricky, and I think the timeframes that we look at are very, very short. I think the other work that's really important is also giving opportunities to women. When I was in Bangladesh, it was really hard to get women in the senior management team, but also in our field offices, you know, that were out and about. And we had some Australian volunteers, and I remember one of them, she came to Dhaka and she said, oh, you know, the men, they start their meetings at 3 or 4 p.m. They're drinking, you know, tea all day and chatting, and then they start their meetings. And that's the time when women have to go home. They're not supposed to be, I mean, the hours were finishing at 4, but they weren't honouring that. And so there was work that we did in terms of changing some of those attitudes internally, which I think is really important. And there was some other work that was supported by our head office, which is, I think, essential work, but not done enough in development. It's often, you know, you think you employ local people and they're somehow going to, you know, move forward in the way you want. But essentially, people are the microcosms of the societies. So they don't walk in the door and their racism and sexism and everything else goes out the door. So that was often an issue, you know, that I found. But there was some incredible work that was done on, it's called the SAA, the Social Action and Analysis. I don't know if you've heard of it. Yep. It's a very intense program, but it's actually an opportunity to have a guided, skilled facilitator work with you on your own assumptions and your own sort of belief systems and your own experience. I mean, I didn't attend because I didn't speak the local language, but I did go to a couple of sessions, and, you know, some of my colleagues shared that, you know, one of them put on a pink t-shirt after the rain and his father hit him, you know, or someone else had an attitude towards, you know, a same-sex couple, and, you know, some of the ways that attitudes are formed. I think that's really powerful work. And I think one of the things that, you know, I think in terms of something that, you know, is lasting is education and opportunities. So some of my colleagues, particularly in Cambodia, when I arrived in Cambodia, we had very few senior national roles. So that was part of our sort of mandate at the time, was to create roles, you know, for all genders, but also making sure that the workplace and the way we operated was, and there was some phenomenal women that came out as sort of junior people. And then I met up with them. I went to Cambodia for a month when I was on my sabbatical to see the dentist because it's so expensive here. But also I had a whole month there, and I had one-on-ones with a whole range of colleagues, and just to hear some of their experiences and what they've been able to do. You know, they've moved on from care, but they're now heading other organisations, UN agencies, other, some of them are doing their own thing, but just their confidence and their belief. Like one fairly young woman was talking about a male colleague who tried to humiliate her, and she was able, in a room, to say, hey, that's not, you know, boldly sort of elder male, but that's not okay. And just, you know, small examples, but really significant ones. I think for some of these people, they had opportunities to grow and to take on leadership. It was very difficult in Cambodia. I think it was the legacy of the Khmer Rouge, where, you know, the intergenerational trauma, but also if you make a mistake, there are consequences. So everything would come up to me as the country director. Colour of t-shirt, sign off. And I'd be like, I'd push it down. No, you make decisions. And so it was a process, but I feel that providing opportunities, the right amount of space, I think is really important. I think that, and just lastly, I'll touch on, I don't know how I'm going for time, but I'll just touch on the work at Indigo. So the approach that Indigo started with 25 years ago was supporting community and women's groups directly. And it was started by a group of aid workers who were either working for AusAid or as consultants at the time. And they'd go travel, as you know, as we do, to some of us do, to very many places, and they'd just find these fledgling or tiny groups that just needed $10,000 or $20,000. They were never going to be able to access the system. They were never going to have the log frames or, you know, jump through all the hoops that, you know, that DFAT and other aid, even international NGOs, put onto local organisations. So they were missing out, but they were representing their communities. So the women gathered, I think, some money from themselves and family and friends, and I think they started with $45,000. And because they had those trusted relationships between them and with their networks, that's how the models evolved. So we still don't advertise with partners. It's all done through the networks, either the board or our sort of development advisors or our volunteer partnership coordinators. It's all volunteer-based, except for 3 part-time staff, which is 1 FTE, including me, a comms person and a finance person. Every other position is a volunteer, and they're an incredible team. And the way that we work is very much that we are introduced to a partner through one of our networks. So, for example, one of our board members in the past introduced us to an organisation called ARCO, which was essentially 600 women who got fed up with violence and just came together with a couple of hundred young girls and just set up a safe house with absolutely nothing. And then they got little bits and pieces of money, 12 months, 6 months, you know the funding. Some of you must, I can see some nods around the room. You know the funding cycle. And then Indigo was introduced to them. We have a year where we provide, like, say, $10,000 as a getting to know you, and then we were able to give them $25,000 a year. And then 2 years ago, we had a sort of a foundation that was willing to give them $50,000 a year over 3 years, and they are now flourishing. So they have, in addition to the safe house, they also provide a community space. So when the New Zealand doctor and nurse comes through, 90 people gather around. It's a tin shed. It's nothing flash, nothing like this, but it's become like a meeting house. And the other important thing they're doing is, separate to the safe house and the community work, is an area where the men get together and work on sort of, their issues. The difficulty, of course, in this remote part of Bougainville is that it's hard for women to leave. Where do you go? It's, it's hard here in an urban setting with a lot more resources. So they also do work on positive parenting. And the important thing is it's all led by local women. So we have a volunteer that goes in every year to visit them. Jenny, she's already lived there and worked there previously. And then, we've seen them flourish. And the other example, which I realised that Jayshree has a connection to, is Indigo's been supporting 2 Dalit groups in Tamil Nadu in the south of India, and it's largely informal groups. They're not registered. Again, they were introduced to Indigo through a network, some of the network. And there's one particular group that's in an urban area in Madura, which is, there's this group of, and I think you'll touch on this as well. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it. So it's a group of Dalit activists, essentially, and Indigo's been supporting them. So it's a education program. Essentially, it's an after-school program where kids from the slum can come, have a few hours in a sort of clean environment with some tutors that get paid like $30 a month. And in addition to that, the lady that was the founder, who unfortunately passed last year, she would also, it's a drop-in centre as well for the women. So they'd come in, and she's an educated woman, as are some of the others, and they let them know about their rights. So you're actually entitled to this benefit. You're entitled to that, and some of them can't read and write. And so the women at this centre will, will help them complete the forms and, and deal with the bureaucracy. We're also supporting education in Afghanistan, again, through the community. It's all done under the radar. We recently took everything off our website because the Taliban is getting even more controlling, and we don't talk about it in public spaces. We work with young people in Timor, and that's really around sexual harassment. So I think that's about trying to change attitudes and behaviours towards sexual harassment. So it's a network of young women up to 25, and then they also engage male advocates to try, and they're working with the ministry and as well as the micro-let drivers. So there's these tiny little buses that go up and down the main road, and they're having conversations, they're putting up signs, they're doing advocacy work, and we are supporting them with unrestricted funding, which is, again, I think for those of us that work in the sector, the holy grail. It's so often donors want to projectise everything, and we don't want to pay for this and we don't want to pay for that. what Indigo can do is say, what do you need? Our board approved 2 new partners. We don't, because we don't have an office and we've got very low sort of, we don't have infrastructure. We finished last year with a surplus, so we've got money now to take on 2 new partners, and we're signing 2 agreements tomorrow. Again, with a group in PNG who are working with the criminal justice system. They get patchy funding, money for this, money for that, but they don't get sort of that funding they need for their organisational sort of strengthening and support. And then another organisation in Timor. So I think in terms of supporting women, I think it is really important that we take a long-term view, that we listen, and we value. Often the value that we have be different. And I think Indigo's approach in terms of sort of respect, but also really allowing our partners to lead, and we work alongside them with support sometimes on whatever it is they want. We don't predetermine what their priorities might be. One of our partners in Rwanda wants help with policies because they're at a much larger scale, and I think to get more money, they need help with policies. So our volunteers working in, when Jenny went to Bougainville, she helped them with computer training. Our partner in Timor, one of our volunteer partnership coordinator, Heidi, works for Our Watch. She did some bystander training with them because that's her sort of area of expertise. So it's really about listening and supporting them, and also having the flexibility with some of the donors don't have. So during COVID, they couldn't bring the kids together. So they looked at alternatives. And we are fortunate that we don't have DFAT funding, I should say. And so we don't have those restrictions. And we are able to really sort of listen. And we also like to take the long-term approach. So we do the 1-year agreement initially, but then it's a 3-year commitment agreement, and then renew it after that with lots of notice, because organisations need that long-term flexible support. And some of our partners don't speak English, so our partner in Indonesia is incredible. They work up in NTT, near Flores, and it's women-headed households that have come together, and they're doing organic farming. They're also providing small bursaries to girls. They asked last year if we could extend it to boys. We said, sure, that's your call, even though Indigo has a focus on women and girls. And we give them like $15,000. And they also do a children festival and a cultural festival, a food festival, which is all about valuing their culture and their local produce. And they're doing a whole lot of stuff. And I stayed with them for a few days when I went to visit alongside Safrina, who's our Indonesian-speaking, Bahasa-speaking partnership coordinator. And the joy these women have, the singing, the karaoke, it's incredible. Because in Indonesia, like in other contexts, if you don't have husband, father, son, then your social status is diminished. You don't have access to social events like weddings and festivals. And so in the time that Indigo has been supporting PECA, it's called, it's a nationwide sort of collection of organisations with the national, and we're supporting the one in NTT. These women, they know what their problems are, but they also know what their solutions are. And I think that's absolutely critical to sort of effective development and also supporting women and girls.
Thank you so much for that. I think I'm still absorbing all of that now. And congratulations on Indigo's new partners. I feel like your point there at the end of, they're sort of leading the way, and it's they're establishing this sounds very much like how you move forward is that locally led, driven by the people who it's affecting development, which is fabulous. So I'm very curious to see, Jayshree, what differs and what's the same across your experience.
So I think there are going to be lots of similarities, and then there are crossovers of common people that we know. But yeah, I thought I'd start with, when I thought of Beijing 30 years ago, I was like, where was I 30 years ago? And I was like, okay, I was second year university up in Brisbane, fairly naive, starting to engage with women's groups and organising on the University of Queensland campus, attending IWD marches in the centre of the city. I'd started a law degree, and it was it was a good opportunity at that time. I was getting involved with some of the work with asylum seekers because I was interested in anti-racism work as well. And it was, to me, an interesting time where we were, even back then, we were having those discussions around how do we create space within the women's movement for diverse voices, for voices of people, women of color, for with all the diversities of women to have a space to shape what was happening in the country, what were the key issues that we were passionate about. And I'm a little bit like Stab, and then I disappeared straight after my studies. I had an opportunity to go out as an Australian volunteer, and it was very passionate about human rights, very interested in human rights law, but also realizing that perhaps I needed to have experience. I'd lived in Fiji, I'd come then to Australia, but I realized my worldview was still quite limited. And so to the India Australian volunteer, landed in a human rights organization, of course, with all of the naiveties and all of the ideas that you have about what human rights looks like. And then the first week I was there, I was given the task of reviewing several dozen affidavits of victims of torture. And this had been set up as there was a sandalwood smuggler who was hiding out in one of the hills, and for a number of years, government had been trying to catch them, so they'd set up a special task force in the Yemen Hills, and they set up, in effect, torture camps. And they brought him because he was very kind to a lot of the local villagers and would often give them support in exchange for being allowed to stay in villages. So the special forces came in and they literally pulled in huge swathes of villagers, both men and women, and would torture them, trying to find out where this person was. And all of this was being set up to try and collect these affidavits. One was to get international support and work with some of the international organizations against torture, but also then to hopefully convince or get enough evidence to prompt a special judicial inquiry into this and to close down those camps. So that was sort of my very quick introduction to what you read and what you study, and then the reality of people's lives and meeting torture victims as they came in and out of the office, or torture survivors, in terms of setting in there, trying to set up this process for them to get a little bit of justice. And I think one thing that India taught me is this is the long game you play, because it took 10 years, for example, to get enough support to set up that commission of inquiry, and to then get people through that system to try and create some change. But I then, the link then to Stav's work is then through that organization, I started engaging in a number of different groups and organizations across the country. And I was fortunate at that time, what was called the National Campaign on Human Rights had just commenced the previous year in India. And it brought together men and women from across the country. And for those, I don't know how familiar you are with the caste system in India, but it's a system of social hierarchy, which has different castes in a very complex social hierarchy. And at the bottom are what called Dalits, or what were formerly known as untouchables, who are seen as ritually and socially polluted. And so I started doing a lot of work with that campaign. I was fortunate when you live in a country like India, where you have 20-odd national languages, and they were like, who can we send around the country to talk to all these people? Because it's not like anyone can speak all the languages. And they'd be like, let's send the volunteer out to talk to. So I had amazing opportunities to talk to people around the country, to hear their stories, but also hear, and this is what took me from a 1-year stint as an Australian volunteer to living 17 years in India, was just amazing breadth of that of activism that's available there, and the incredible things that people did with very little resources, but the way that people fought and found solutions to different situations they were in. So I did a lot of work for many years at the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, and I would come in around some of the sort of the advocacy work, putting together policy papers. And then over time, because this movement had some incredibly vibrant Dalit women leaders, including ones that Stav knows, Guna and others, that we started talking more and more, and they had all been part of the Beijing process where they had been starting to talk about, we need to talk about difference, we need to talk about what we now often call about intersectionality and what intersectional discrimination and violence looks like. And so then part of the work I was doing with, started to talk with colleagues about, let's start to say what that looks like, because there was a lot of sort of talking about, yes, these women are thrice oppressed, need to have specific action and support for them, even within the work and the support that was happening for Dalit groups, or within the women's movement, a specific focus on them. But we were like, well, what are those experiences like? So I, myself and two colleagues, we decided that we would start to do, with this national campaign and a whole host of women leaders, we decided that we were going to do one piece of action research. And it ended up being, well, first we spent about 4 years going around the country, and we decided, we're very clear. I was from outside. My colleague was an Indian man, another colleague was an American man, and we were very conscious of who we were and our identities. We worked with a whole host of women leaders who were then supporting this process, and we said, right, we want to support and train young Dalit women researchers to lead this research, because we want, given the structures of oppression that they lived with and what life in communities were like, we wanted women to feel protected and safe, to be able to share some of their stories of what they were experiencing in terms of discrimination and violence in different communities. So we worked across 4 states of India, 2 in the south and 2 in the north. And over a number of years, brought that all together into a report that then, in a way, has helped and supported a number of Dalit women's groups to be able to actually give evidence, to be able to sort of cite statistics, to be able to give evidence of what that discrimination and violence was, and particularly to work not to also create space within the Dalit movement, which is, as often many movements are, male-dominated, to give that space for specific focus on women's issues and women's specific experiences of caste discrimination and violence, as well as gender-based violence. And then also then to have that conversation with the wider movement, which would often, and you get into these conversations where they'd often go, well, and some of you might see the similarities, some of the conversations that happen sometimes here, where it's like, well, there's also a lot of violence happening in their community, and there's a lot of domestic violence. So shouldn't we really focus on that first, and then we should focus on caste-based violence? And it was really work in these Dalit women leaders. We were going, actually, no, we need to talk about both, and to recognize that this caste and gender-based violence, this intersectional violence, has such a huge impact on our life, and it also has an impact on men's lives, and then how, in terms of the history and as systemic inequalities and violence, how that also perpetuates other forms of violence that happen between men and women in the community. So that was a big chunk of the work that we did for a number of years, and it was nice to see then more and more space being created within the Dalit movement for women, particularly a lot of the work I did was around access to justice. So it was really about going, okay, how can we, within that system, try to strengthen the specialized procedures that were there to support women to access justice, particularly after cases of violence. And then also on the other side, through the national campaign, was really a focus on law reform. Because in India, there's a special law that's created, the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act, which lists a whole range of atrocities, which are extreme forms of violence based on caste, discrimination. And this was really a chance to sort of try to reshape that law to strengthen some of the legal protections for this community. And what was great to see was that then a lot of the Dalit women were pushing for, let's also specifically give some specific protections for women within the community. And then again, 10 odd years of a coalition of organizations, about 400 organizations around the country, managed to finally in 2015, 16, can't remember, around then, was to actually finally get those legal reforms through and to be able to sort of see some of the specific forms of violence against Dalit women being criminalized for the first time. It was nice to see some good conversations around consent, because there was a lot of focus on extreme rates of sexual violence against women in these communities because of the way they were perceived by other caste people. And to be able to go, yes, we need to sort of get to the point where just because they were not resisting what was happening to them because of those very unequal hierarchies of power in their community settings, that did not mean that they were consenting, and that was specifically written into the law. So it sort of had some wins around at least seeing greater legal protection, but like everything, what's on law, what's in practice, what changes when you have an extreme right-wing Hindu fundamentalist government come into power in 2016, and some of the changes and challenges then that have then occurred around some of the unfortunate rhetoric coming out of a number of male leaders of sanctioning a lot of gender-based violence. But I think still nonetheless you go, okay, regardless, and to me what India taught me is that people's ability to struggle on 20 years, 10 years into legal law reform, 20, 30 years, I mean, it's an incredible activism, including people like Guna and others that have worked around the country and continue to work in small communities and going right. We'll still keep our eye on those bigger picture, but at the same time, we want in our individual communities to see change happening. And seeing more Dalit women step up into leadership roles, seeing more Dalit women get through education schemes and other supports, get an education, move into different positions, be able to engage in those wider discussions that are happening around the country, around the moment, a lot around democracy and the future of human rights. So that was sort of a chunk of my time, and then in 2016 I left and moved to Fiji, which is where I'm originally from, and took a position with the Pacific Community, SPC, which is an intergovernmental organization, and I was specifically in the human rights team. And there continued the work around gender-based violence in particular. So we did a lot of work. The team I was with had played a key role in working with Pacific Island governments to establish domestic violence laws across the Pacific. So we did a lot of work around law development in this space. And then when I came in, a lot of it was really trying to to work with particularly judges, with lay magistrates, because in a lot of the Pacific, you don't have a lot of legally trained magistrates at that level. So a lot of them are lay magistrates, people of eminence in the community that take on the role of interpreters or that face domestic violence, for example. So spent a lot of time doing a lot of legal training for them to be able to understand what a social law is about, because you realize that particularly with domestic violence, it's not enough to just know the letter of the law, but to really understand, did they understand the cycle of domestic violence? Did they understand how to deal with situations where women might come forward, might then retract their statement, might come back again, and how to provide that support without jumping into let's mediate a family solution to this. So a lot of work we did around that area. And then for me, I think this is where I saw, and a little bit mirrors some of what you were saying about needing to think about. It's great to work sometimes with, you need to work at that level, but to me, to go, how do you start to prevent this violence from happening in the first place? And this is where that whole point around attitudes and realizing it is very hard to produce attitudinal change with adults in many ways. And so that is where I started to swing more towards, can we start to think about children, education, and think about approaches that start to really look at what does human rights, gender equality look like for us as Pacific Islanders in our context? How do we define it? How do we link it to our values as Pacific Islanders? How do we link it to our proverbs? How do we link it to our different cultural practices that may not look like typical or perhaps Western ideas about gender equality and rights, but nonetheless are ways that have given women space, role, and status in our community. So how do we start to position that more in our conversations and our ways of doing things? And so work to develop an education program with my then team, and then we rolled that out working with 4 ministries of education that were interested across the North Pacific, so in say, Marshalls, Vanuatu, Kiribati and Tuvalu. We worked with the ministries of education then to work around strengthening their curriculum and recognizing that the teaching curriculum is flooded with way too many subjects. Teachers were drowning and going, look, all we want will do is we'll come in and we'll look at what's in your existing curriculum, and we want to strengthen that and look at specific ways of teaching those kinds of topics and subjects. Because we found out, for example, a lot of curriculums were putting in work around gender-based violence, but then teachers didn't know how to teach it or felt uncomfortable, so they would just avoid the topic. We went, all right, we need to find ways that people feel comfortable to have these conversations and can draw on local expertise of women's organizations, our women's crisis centers in the Pacific as resources to be able to really think about how to teach that in a way that suited our context. So yeah, so that's some of the work that I've done in Pacific, and then 2021. So a bit like that. After about 20 odd years, I was like, right, COVID makes interesting decisions for us, and I decided to come back to Australia. And by chance, Child Fund had just created this gender equality, disability and social inclusion role, and it was a thing that I was like, well, actually, I still want to continue to work with children and young people, because I think there's a lot of energy in that space, but I think there's also a lot of hope for working with children and young people. So that's where I've come into Child Fund. And again, it's a different type of challenge. For me, it's coming back into an Australian context. It's different language in many ways to the language that I used in India, the language I used in Pacific. So it's almost like learning a new language coming back here. But it was also, to me, the challenge that I think perhaps some of us also face is when you're working with an organization that has, yes, a strong focus on children and young people broadly. How do you start to really have those conversations about why focus on girls and why focus on children with disabilities? Why are we focusing on certain groups and not just focusing on all children as vulnerable groups, if you want to put it that way. So that's been sort of part of my role over the last couple of years, has been really to sort of work with our teams, work with our partners, look at supports where there are interesting opportunities for us to really start to pilot, extend, start creating specific strategies to reach the different groups of children more deliberately. And we have some good programming. Your colleagues in Wilmington, they will know we've got some good programming to work on. For example, in PNG, we run the One Talk Helpline Line, which is the only helpline, national helpline there, that provides counselling services, emergency counselling services for gender-based violence survivors. And we're now extending that to also to support children as well in need. So we've been working for a number of years that slowly expanding out to all the 22 provinces in PNG. Been doing work around with young people around adapting some of the curriculum that UN Women and others had created many years ago around how do you connect with respect curriculum that was created for looking at how do you talk about gender and GBV in schools and adapting that to a Papua New Guinea context. We do work around sports for development, and that has a strong focus on gender equality, where we're really looking at how do we use sports as a medium to then have conversations with children and young people, and using rugby values as a way to teach about gender equality and inclusion, and then seeing how they can put it into practice in terms of not only girls in sports, but then how do you train women to be referees and jump into those roles? How do you provide leadership opportunities within the sports space, and see how that can then translate to some attitudinal change in terms of how these women then are accepted into the community, and their roles in the community as well. So yeah, so it's been an interesting journey.
I'll say.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like a whole adventure along the way, and it's so interesting to hear about, you know, working with youth now, of all of the systemic changes you've spoken about from the beginning. Is we need to continue with that generation in order to change them. So I think definitely for myself, and I imagine for some of the other earlier career professionals in the room, it's so interesting to hear about the changes and developments over time, having not been there to witness them in the sector before. So I was just wondering, before we hand over to questions from the room, you know, there are a lot of good things that have happened over 30 years since the Beijing Declaration. There are things that still need to be worked on. What do you sort of see as the highlights of things that have gone well, where we've really improved, and maybe where focuses should be to continue going forward from here?
I think a definite positive is the greater focus on localization, and I certainly, you know, in my time working in the sector, I've seen, you know, roles that I would have done, or, you know, sort of foreigners, are now taken up by Cambodians. So, for example, I was the country director from whatever it was, 2010 to 2015. Both country directors since me have been Cambodians. And so it's providing those sort of leadership positions. And I think also the other thing that's happened in the sector is there's been greater discussion of localization. I know when I was working at WiAD, you know, a while ago, we wouldn't talk about it, whereas now there are people that are talking about it. And there have been some steps done. Even Samantha Power, you know, she had, you know, when she was in charge of USAID, had recognised the value of it. So I think there's been a lot of opportunities, and I think there's also, it's still very small. Like, I think when you look at the numbers, it's pretty depressing. But it has, in some contexts, it has translated to sort of more local groups, sort of, and sort of network-based groups developing. You don't always need an international organisation to do things. I think that attitude has changed in the time that I've worked in the sector. Yeah, and I think also the you know, the understanding of sort of power and those sorts of things, you know, like I think I draw those three, not just focusing on the women in development and saying, okay, it's just women, they've got to, you know, sort it out. I think there have been a number of, you know, players and actors in the development sector that are actually looking at that sort of harder piece. You know, I think you described some of the pieces beautifully, you know, like the attitudes and the curriculum and those sorts of things, which are not nice and neat in a sort of 3-year project, and we've done it all. It's sort of looking at sort of those harder things, but the things that are going to get you the significant results. Yeah.
And I guess for me, yes, definitely that. And I think of, I guess, the women's space and the spaces I've been in, for me, what's great to see is from years ago when it was still a new word, and Kimberly Crenshaw and all of her writing around intersectionality was new, to now, I guess, the amount of engagement and interrogation that's happening around what does intersectionality look like? How can we really meaningfully engage with difference and understand how gender intersects with all different aspects of identity and and creates different types of oppression and privilege. So I think that to me has been something that I've seen has changed over time and has become more crystallized as part of, I guess, getting more part of our mainstream, if I want to put a better word, for want of a better word, thinking around how do we understand people in communities and women in communities, and how do we factor in difference. I think we're still a long way to go in terms of how does that really then translate in practice, but I think at least there's a I guess a little bit more openness and around that, and then the thinking around how do we create space for different women's voices, as well as in terms of male champions around gender equality as well.
Fabulous. Yeah, good progress has been made, and we're just going to continue doing that. And most of the people in this room are contributing to it. So thank you for doing it. So I do have some of the questions that were asked online when people were signing up, but I might go first to, does anyone from the room have a question they want to throw at our wonderful speakers? Don't be shy. First question's always hardest, but
I guess I got a personal question. I thank you both for sharing your career stories, most amazing experiences you've had. I guess I'm curious, you lived in India for 17 years. What did you miss when you left? Such an amazing country to live.
Yeah.
Have that experience.
I missed people.
Yeah.
I remember when I left India and came to Sydney, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so cold here. It's so small.
Yeah, so spacious.
Yeah, it's so spacious. I'm not quite sure if I could. No, but I think I made incredible friends around the country, and I think I missed that vibrancy of. It can be exhausting as well, but I felt like every conversation was replete with politics and challenging each other's and passion, and there was in some ways good and bad. There was less of a divide between your personal and your political life, but I think it was just I missed the variety of people, the constant challenging of each other, and also just the variety of solutions that people created out of very meaningful. Like I know the head of the campaign. I just love it because he had this great way of going. Don't worry about the money. Come up with the great ideas. We will find the money somehow to do them. But he was it was just that feeling that anything's possible. Maybe the awful situation, maybe the most difficult of challenges, but we'll find a way to get a solution happening. So I think that perseverance and constantly looking at ways to find solutions is something that I just think, it's incredible about living in a country like that.
Yeah. Thank you.
fantastic. Any other brave questions, or would you like some rumination time while I ask something? Oh, we've got one here.
This might also be a bit too personal a question, but Stav, you were in particular talking about how you felt sort of you've done a lot of work, and you were feeling that you're wondering how much impact it had, particularly in places like Myanmar. How do you deal with that sort of sense of either slow or, in some cases, like what's happened in Myanmar, backwards change from both a personal and professional level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember expressing my frustration to someone in Myanmar because it was very slow going and things just took a lot longer. There's a lot of bureaucracy that was introduced by the NLD. So what would have taken one trip to Naypyidaw might take 3 or 4 trips. A lot more sort of regulations and I think it was trying to have a long-term view. And I remember one person in this instance saying to me that if you can keep things calm during a crisis, that's a great contribution to make. And I was really fortunate. I developed a meditation practice when I was in Bangladesh, of all places, and I think that really helped me sort of also be very conscious of not verbalizing everything. In Australia, you can be a lot more direct, and your body language, I think it is quite different. It is like learning a different language, and you sort of observe people and say, how is it appropriate to say this, and so forth. And it was, understanding that change does take a very long time. And I think there's also, I think when the time is that you can't do anymore. I think that, it was time for me to pass that baton on. I'd sort of reached my sort of ability to keep engaged, and yeah, it was time for me to do something different. I think what kept me going was just seeing my incredible colleagues. You know, they were leapfrogging in terms of opportunities that were opening up, and it was hard to actually maintain staff. We had a couple of hundred staff, and there was so many, it was an explosion of opportunities in the private sector, in the UN, and just seeing them flourish, you know, take on studies and start small businesses. And yeah, it's also a privilege just to live there, you know. I mean, I don't know, I just found it really incredible to have an opportunity to live and understand, or, you know, not that you fully understand, but just have interactions and exposure like I did. Yeah.
I feel like I'm feeling like that right now. Quite anxious with USAID and the number of governments reducing their aid budgets and the possibility of doing the same. I guess, like, would you have that same advice that staying calm in a crisis is a good? I've got these colleagues in Kenya who are just losing their jobs and their livelihoods, and they're just, it's really depressing right now.
I mean, we are in a really awful moment in history, you know, with what's happening in the US, what was announced in the UK, what could possibly happen in our own, you know, government sort of, you know, after the election. Yeah, it is a moment to, yeah, I think that it's quite understandable that people are worried. I think my own strategy is to sort of guard my senses in a way. Like, I started listening to the 5th podcast about what's happening at USAID, you know, the DevEx. And I'm like, I don't need to know the intricacies of every court case and how it's going. You know, maybe I'll go for a walk in the park instead. So I think we've got to find our own way of sort of making sense, you know, keeping sane. I think it's also about opportunities. I mean, it is an awful time. I think you were sharing how Red Cross was started by one individual, you know, and there is a lot of wealth in Australia. You know, the wealth I was shocked at how much wealth was created during COVID, you know. We're also seeing the inequality. And I think there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, we don't see that the other bilateral donors are going to step in to whatever the slash is going to be to the overall USAID. But I think in our spheres of influence, I think it's so important for us to talk about the value of what we do and why we do it. I mean, I think that's got to happen. But I also see that there are a lot of opportunities in philanthropy. If you look at the money that's out there, you know, currently, I mean, I've been tracking, I don't understand philanthropy in Australia, but I've been tracking it the last couple of years that I've been working with Indigo. I think only 4 or 6% of it goes internationally. Yeah. But younger people that are coming in, I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of the numbers about what young people are going to inherit in the next decade or so. Yes. And so I think it's an opportunity for us, of course, to grieve what's happening and the way it's happened. I think that's what concerns me, is that, you know, that it's just not respecting the labour laws that we fought so hard for. Sure, you can sack someone, but you've got due process, and that's all, you know, particularly if you've got colleagues like you do, Jacinta, and just seeing the hurt that's happening in all the local organisations and programs that are being stopped. But I think it's also a time for us to look at opportunities. There was a really good piece that was put out, I think it was one of the development networks, called this Silver Lining or something. I don't know if you saw it. There's a couple of interesting reflections. So I think it is I think it's important for us to talk about what the other opportunities might be. I mean, at ACFID, we're continuing our advocacy, you know, to talk about what the implications are. You know, usually it's in relation to national interest, you know, but there's a whole lot of and there's a whole range of conversations that need to happen. So I think we've got, you know, as people, you know, that believe in sort of international solidarity and the importance of equality, it's important to have those conversations. And look, it's not going to be easy. I think the next few years are going to be pretty awful. So it's about maintaining sort of our sanity, but also trying to be strategic and seeing where those new opportunities might be and how we influence sort of the understanding of some of those people that do want to, you know, Indigo gets some funding from some wealthy individuals. And I've been having conversations with one in particular. It's incredible, just the passion and the concern and also the willingness to learn. And I think there's many people in the room that can provide that.
I can just say Tao, who is online from Vietnam. resonated
Yes.
with your question.
Fabulous.
No,
and
no,
thank you
I
for
do not
joining us.
have any questions.
Pardon?
Yeah, sorry, I do not have any question. I just like the ideas regarding to the USAID because we are experiencing some difficulties in Vietnam with both the machinery of government change and also the USAID project. So we find that it's really difficult, especially for many community projects. As you know that, for example, now with current USAID, there around 90% of their projects are closed, so are terminated. I have to say that. So it's affect a lot of people here. So that's the reason why I wanted to participate in this one, to learn from you guys and to see what we can do in Vietnam. Thanks.
Is everyone in the room familiar with what's happening with USAID? Yep, okay.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that leads well into one of the questions from online was, how can we support each other at this time as women in the sector? And particularly, how can we support local actors who are working on these issues, especially grassroots and community organizations? So taking away from tonight, what can everyone who's been here do in their own sector and their lives to combat these things?
I'll put that out here to what do people think rather than as us.
Just following on what firstly, thank you both of you. It was fascinating to hear experiences, but I think what you said about philanthropy and tapping into the wealth that's to come, but also tapping into young people, as you said, and actually getting people here understanding why we do what we do and why it's so important and why solidarity is so important, and making sure that whilst our focus might be in international development, like actors here in the community here can be such decision makers, voters who will change the narrative and can change the narrative. So I think making sure that we're having dinner table conversations with our friends and peers and colleagues who are outside the sector and maybe aren't as clued in and tapped in as to why it's so important, making sure that they understand really the implications of what this means and the consequences of it, and getting people on board with the idea that this is a really good thing if we can continue to support one another in a multitude of ways. And as you say, there are young people who are going to come up, inherit wealth. They might be wanting to share that passion and wealth in a philanthropic sense, and to engage with them now as well. So not just in a political sense in voting and those decisions, but also in that kind of philanthropic and emotional connection sense as well.
I'm picking up because a lot of these issues, yes, they're outside what USAID, what's happening with USAID's thing, but there are a lot of issues in our own country. And I think to me, this is more than any other time, this is a chance to go, how do we tap into those networks that are pushing back against attacks on different areas of women's rights or on trans rights or on other areas, and to me building wider solidarity, because I feel like now is the time not only to build solidarity and again across women's groups and movements, but again for all the different areas that are under attack, whether it be trans rights or First Nations people's rights or refugee rights. I think these are the areas that we need to build those networks of solidarity and support, because all of them, in one way or the other, are falling under fire.
Yeah, and I guess it's really topical because right now there's the Nexus Summit happening in Melbourne, which is for the next generation of philanthropists. But I feel like before working with Philanthropy Australia, when I was working at ACFID and in the aid program in UN, I didn't really know anything about philanthropy, and even hearing the term Nexus, it's not really something that gets talked about very often. So maybe there's also a chance to learn a bit more about it and also encourage a lot of philanthropists. So they have to give, if they're a private philanthropic foundation, they have to give a minimum of 5% of disbursement at the moment. And the Productivity Commission was encouraging them to give a bit more. That's received a bit of pushback, but it's a minimum. It's a minimum disbursement, and so there's no reason to not encourage philanthropists to give a little bit more. Some are doing a spend down approach that care about the international sector. But yeah, it is something that I think creating the space for those conversations, I think is really important, and not just those that are focusing domestically. There's initiatives like the Australian Investing in Women and AIDEN, the Australian International Development Network, which is again a network of philanthropists that care a lot about the development sector. Does anyone know AIDEN? Any of you know AIDEN? Great. Okay, so maybe there's chance. I know that they themselves are being asked though, what can they do to fill the gap for what's happening in the US? And so it's a really interesting time to look at and think about, especially with the pushback on diversity. So for me, and hearing your story about, you're working not just on children, that intersectionality, like disability rights. And when I hear about all of these diversity and inclusion areas across the US government being shut down, it's not just about women's employment, these are specialist roles around universal design, accessibility. This is not something that you can just replace. So I almost feel like it's such a great chance. I wish we had like an institute. Where's our Institute of Diversity to hire these amazing people so that it's not lost, given that we have these heritage foundations and these other institutes that are being created to try and say, how can we cut back on diversity and inclusion? Where's the equivalent alternative? I don't know, but I'm grateful that we've got these kinds of forums to actually, be able to talk about it a little bit. So,
and I think in those conversations, it's really important to talk about effective development. Like I know when I was working in the private sector and driving a taxi and so forth, I just used to sponsor a child and thought that just takes care of the world's problems, And as I sort of started working in the sector and then when I lived overseas, and I remember my goddaughter saying to me, oh yeah, I'm going to sponsor a child. And there's nothing against sponsoring a children. It's just that that's not the solution to effective development. And so I think some of the things that the donors haven't been able to, because, USAID had its strengths, but it was also projectized. It was also national interest, a lot of political sort of decision, but let's not get into that because we'll be here all night. But it's also an opportunity to do development differently and to sort of, to ask the questions that you have, what have you seen that works? And I think we know it inherently, we know that you've got to take a time, you've got to work on the policies, you've got to work on attitudes and all those things. And I think, if you can sort of inform philanthropists or others about those sorts of issues, then we might actually end up getting something better. I don't know.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you to everyone who's contributed. I love it becomes more of a discussion because that's what we're here for, is to share amongst a network of professionals, and everyone in this room has some fantastic ideas and experience. So that's amazing. Sadly, I might have to cut us off there. We do have time for networking and chatting afterwards. So maybe some discussion from some of the experts in the room about philanthropy and some of more of those other ideas about what we can do from today could be shared then. But it might be about time for us to wrap up the formal part of the night. So please thank me. Please join me. Very good. Please join me in thanking Stav and Jayshree for their time and their insights. I'd also like to thank the rest of the Women in Aid and Development Leadership Group who've supported smooth running of tonight's event, and to BDO for hosting us in this beautiful space and providing all of the lovely things for us to eat and drink. And an extra thank you to Chris, our chair, who brings us all together for these events. So that brings us to the end of the discussion portion. So as I said before, please stay in touch with us online through either our website, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn. I highly recommend that you join our mailing list through the website to stay updated on events and opportunities. And if you'd like, you can become a Women in Aid and Development member, which will assist us financially, as well as giving you the opportunity to participate in our mentoring program, either as a mentor or mentee, depending on your industry experience. Our next event will be held in May on the topic of reproductive choice in the aid and development sector. So given everything that's going on, I'm sure that will be a very spicy topic. So I'm sure it's going to be very interesting, and would love to see you all there and get some more thoughts on what we can do and how we can incorporate those ideas into our work. So finding out the details is another reason for you to join that mailing list and follow our socials. But for now, that's the end of tonight's sessions. So we're going to wrap up now and hopefully see you in May. I would like to, just give you a little thank you for the night. We've got these We do a little show and tell. Surprise, surprise, it's a Women in Aid and Development mug. It's a mystery every time what we're going to be asking. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right, and thank you to all of you for coming along, and we'd love to keep chatting to you afterwards and see you at our future events.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Jamie.
Great job.
Do we want to do a group photo or anything?
Oh,
afterwards,
yes,
or-
you can't go without a photo or three. Thanks to everyone online, and we'll say cheerio for now. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank
Can
you.
we grab everyone for a photo while we're all still at the table?
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks, Serena. Ready.